This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Alex Gray, who serves as CEO of American Global Strategies, LLC. They discuss the strategic importance of Greenland and the Panama Canal in U.S. foreign policy, particularly during the Trump administration. Gray emphasizes the historical context of U.S. interest in Greenland, the potential for Chinese influence in the Arctic, and the implications of Greenland's possible independence. The discussion then shifts to the Panama Canal, highlighting concerns over Chinese control and the need for U.S. involvement in its governance.
Alex Gray, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Roger.
Well, you are the CEO of American Global Strategy, and you, of course, are a veteran of the Trump administration's first-term National Security Council in the White House. You were chief of staff for the National Security Council there. And someone who has been, I'd put in the category of a thoughtful explainer of some of the more surprising elements of President Trump's foreign policy in his second term, specifically Greenland, as well as the Panama Canal. And it's great to have you on today to talk about those items and other issues related to the Trump administration foreign policy and national security. I think I'd like to start at the outset, Alex, is just give us some context for Greenland, either becoming part of the United States or changing its current status and something between what it stands today and becoming part of the United States. And that context meaning not just in terms of how we think about, how President Trump thinks about Greenland, but actually the work you've done on this and thinking about this for quite some time. Over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Roger. Look, the Greenland issue, despite kind of the reputation that it's starting to get in the media as one of these, Trump, it's now associated with President Trump and is associated with his kind of unique public persona and style. The reality is that U.S. concern about Greenland from a security perspective goes back to the Andrew Johnson administration, right? It goes back to William Henry Seward, Lincoln, Johnson, Secretary of State, who tried to buy Greenland in the 1860s, precisely because he was concerned that as we were having poor relations with France and Britain, they would end up taking Greenland from the Danes, and it would end up becoming a dagger, to take another famous phrase used in Asia, a dagger pointed at the heart of the East Coast of the United States. And we've tried to buy Greenland. Harry Truman tried to buy it twice. We tried to buy it during the First World War. We occupied it during World War II. We were concerned during the Cold War. Ronald Reagan was obviously, in his administration, John Lehman, they were very concerned about the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap and the ability of Soviet submarines to come down from Murmansk and threaten the East Coast. So there's a long history of U.S. strategic concern about Greenland that long predates Donald Trump. My interest in this came in 2018, 2019, when the president started talking about it, and I was working on Pacific Islands issues, and I had the portfolio at the time that dealt with our kind of unique relationships with three Pacific Island states, the Compacts of Free Association, so Marshall Islands, Palau, and Micronesia. And those are very unique because they are independent sovereign states, UN members, with whom we have very durable, very sophisticated security and economic treaties. And I began thinking, well, what if we had some sort of Compact of Free Association-like agreement with Greenland? And so, as one of the ideas, and I think the president has talked about outright, territorial annexation, making an insular area of the United States, there are a lot of different options, one of which I think could definitely be a compact like we have in the Pacific.
Compact, free association. Don't hear President Trump talking about it in those terms, but certainly would be, perhaps one of the possibilities. And you make a good point in terms of where we've seen some precedent elsewhere, the work you did in the last administration. And then the historical context, too, is quite helpful, and oftentimes it doesn't get discussed. You mentioned Reagan's Secretary of Navy, John Lehman, and you're absolutely right. The gap was key to his naval strategy, and it was built on the assumption that we need to put the Soviets on their heels. We couldn't just cede the space. and we need to make sure that our surface fleet and certainly our undersea vessels were able to get closer to the Soviet coastal waters up in that part of the world. You did in the Pacific too. Key part of the Cold War strategy, precedent there in that respect. Give us a sense of where it matters today and who we're concerned about. I mean, certainly we're not concerned about the Danes, right? And certainly we're not concerned about the French, the Germans, some of the other historical cases you've raised. Far more about perhaps Russia or really importantly China. So talk about what was animating your thinking back when you looked at this in the last administration and why it's relevant right now.
Right. Same strategic logic, different players. And the way, to think about it, and you mentioned tongue in cheek, the Danes, this is really important. This has become an issue about the U.S. and Denmark. It has nothing to do with the U.S. and Denmark. They're great friends. They're great allies. They fought beside us in every war since World War II. The Danes are fantastic. The reality is, though, Greenland has been on a path for 40 years to get independence from Denmark. And they're going to get independence. They say it in their national security strategy. Their prime minister says it openly. They will likely get independence from Denmark in the next decade. And the question for me is, what comes after the 50,000 people of the second least densely populated place on Earth are independent? And having worked in the Pacific Islands, knowing the history of how China operates, and the Russians we can talk about, but let's focus on the Chinese for a minute. The Chinese have said, they're going to have this polar Silk Road, which is an adjunct of the Belt and Road Initiative. And we've seen how this plays out all over Southeast Asia, the Pacific, Africa, Latin America. They come in, they use exploitative economic practices, coercive economic practices. First, they come in with high interest loans. They build underperforming infrastructure. They gain concessions of natural resource extraction and production, and it very quickly morphs into military access, political coercive control, and that's what I worry about, Roger. I worry about the Chinese playbook being applied to a newly independent Greenland that doesn't have the economic or population power to resist China's ambitions in the Arctic. They say they're going to be a near Arctic power, which is absurd, but that's what they say, and we should take them seriously. And so we need to start thinking about, okay, this is a choice. This is not about Copenhagen. The choice here is what comes after Greenlandic independence. Do we want Beijing and Moscow waiting with their arms out for an independent Greenland, or do we want it to be the United States? And to me, that's the choice, and we just have to find the mechanism.
So a decade out, possibly, of their independence as part of, you said, their national security strategy. A couple of follow-ups on that. Greenland, Greenlanders, I'm assuming that's the way you refer to those residing in Greenland. How do they view China? I mean, when you talk about the Polar Silk Road, is this something that is popular, not popular? They've never seen somebody from China. It's reasonable, Alex, for you to say, hey, this is something we could expect the Chinese, the PRC to do. They've obviously named it the Polar Silk Road, but how much is this manifest already? Surely it's not the levels we've seen back in the areas of the Pacific, which you worked so hard on the last time you served in government.
Yeah, we haven't seen it yet. We've seen indications. When I was in government, the Chinese did make some efforts to try and gain mining concessions, an airport, because Denmark it's still the Kingdom of Denmark. The Danes can exercise a great deal of control, and as long as it's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, I don't worry too much about what's going to happen with the Chinese or the Russians. That is one of the values of Greenland remaining under the security umbrella of our friends in Copenhagen. That's why I always say this is about what comes next, because right now I think the equilibrium is relatively stable. To what, how do the Greenlanders view China? The conversations I've had with people in Nuuk, their capital, basically go like this. Look, there are 50,000 of us. If we want to be independent, when we're independent, we're not. This is similar to what the Pacific Islanders say. They say, look, we don't play geopolitics. We don't play the great game. If you want to come and invest and create jobs and create wealth, we're all for it. If Chinese, Russian, American, Danish, whoever. And that's the concern. That's the same thing we saw in the Solomon Islands, in Tonga, in Papua New Guinea, in Cambodia. I mean, this playbook, again, is well trodden. And I think that's why we have to be so wary now about what do we have in our quiver, what arrows are in our quiver for the day that we have the independent state of Nuke and it's a UN member and China and Russia come looking with, predatory claws out to try and take what they can. And that's what we need to be prepared for.
What about the Danes and all this? NATO ally, they've fought with us. We've had the diplomatic back and forth as President Trump has raised the profile of this issue and articulated kind of his ambition for Greenland, although at the time of this recording, we've just had a recent post by President Trump following his reference to Greenland during his State of the Union, which it was a joint session of Congress where President Trump said, we're going to leave it to the Danes, to the Greenlanders to decide. And so it's not the sort of thing where any action or development would be taken that would be against the will of those who live there. And then we've had a post, which you can describe, I've not seen, where President Trump kind of builds on that. So give us a sense of where you see President Trump right now as he's looking at Greenland. And then also give us a sense of the Danes and what space there may be for, call it a deal that gets overdone, I think, with President Trump in the White House. But this idea of working with an ally who would otherwise also not want the Chinese in their backyard post a possible, as you've described, independence of Greenland.
As you know, Roger, I mean, this stuff, whether it's in Greenland, Washington, Copenhagen, domestic politics always play a role in how countries posture and how they play on the world stage. And the way that the United States is in this space now has created reactions in the Danish system where people are taking positions that they would not have taken absent this level of U.S. interest, right? And so people are posturing for their constituencies. And so what you're seeing is, there was a broad acceptance in Denmark for decades that, they have a very fraught colonial history with Denmark or with Greenland, similar to our history with our indigenous population. There's long been an acceptance that Greenland's on the path to gradual independence. The U.S. interest in Greenland, going back to 2018, but particularly the last couple of months, has caused the political system to basically react by acting as if they have no interest in ever parting with Greenland, and this is just an absolute essential core part of Denmark's kingdom. That is not what the debate was like just a couple of years ago. So people are reacting for their own domestic audiences. I think the ultimate solution here is, as President Trump has said, Greenland's going to make their own decision, whether that's a national referendum, whether that's some sort of a referendum followed by a vote in the Danish parliament. There are going to be the legal mechanisms. But ultimately, Denmark, the United States, and Greenland are going to have to sit down on a trilateral basis and talk about what comes after Greenlandic independence, right? What's the mechanism for making sure that Greenland doesn't become a security threat both to Europe, to the EU, to NATO, to North America? As you said, Denmark has no interest in Greenland being a vacuum, a void being in post-independence Greenland. That's not in their interest. So I think they have every reason to work with us to find a solution, whether it's a compact or territorial accession or some sort of additional, U.S. military support to an independent Greenland, whatever it might be. I think they have a real vested interest in working with us on that solution.
We'll see on that front. I think if it's our allies, the Danes, working with those from Greenland, with our government, behind closed doors, negotiating on this for the security lens, that's sort of the thing that you can get behind and make sense. Certainly the temperature in Washington and the media coverage suggests there's other factors and elements at play. If you look at it from an economic standpoint, he set aside the security concerns, which of course is what's animating our discussion, Alex. The U.S. doesn't really benefit from this sort of thing, right? This is not a place with great real estate opportunities, I don't think, right? Or some sort of investment opportunities that is going to yield a whole lot from the United States taking on Greenland in terms of the benefits and costs that might be imposed on the American taxpayer should Greenland become part of the U.S. either outright or compact or free association and the like. Just talk about that for a second in terms of what Is there an argument to be made that this is something that actually would benefit the American taxpayer, security considerations aside?
You know, there are a lot of open questions about that. I mean, we know anecdotally that there's always been believed to be a large amount of critical minerals and just general natural wealth, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's extractive minerals, critical minerals, whatever it may be. What people in that industry will tell you is we've never done the type of real geological survey that needs to be done to even begin to make realistic estimates for what's under the surface.
So this is not like the Cook Islands or whatever, kind of by analogy, go back to the Pacific where you see there's rich in mineral resources that has been surveyed that you knew you can draw from,
Right.
where it would be economically beneficial to have investment there in addition to security considerations. This is far more of kind of an undiscovered, unexplored area as it relates to Greenland.
Much more speculative. And we have enough information to know that there are resources there. We don't have enough information to really make serious economic estimates, not just about how much is under the ground, but also how deep, what's the geological formation, and how difficult would that make extraction, and what the cost would be of extraction versus then what they would fetch on the market. I mean, all the things that businesses and geologists have to think about when they're making these determinations.
Is there any sense that the current status that we have, this is part of Denmark, that making these sorts of investments, explorations with Greenland now, again, part of Denmark, there's a barrier to entry or an ability to pursue this? Is there anything preventing this sort of work going on today for an American concern that might be interested?
Well, I've heard from multiple people in the industry that, look, as long as it is unclear what the path to independence is, or is Greenland really going on that route, as long as that question is unresolved, there's a level of risk that definitely makes it difficult for multinational mining concerns to make the type of huge investment that's going to be needed even to survey. And
we're with Alex Gray. He's the CEO of American Global Strategies and a former chief of staff of the National Security Council during President Trump's first term. We're talking Greenland in the moment. We're going to shift to the Western Hemisphere and go to the Panama Canal. Alex, really interesting way you kind of capture the security concerns in a pretty sober fashion. This is not some sort of colonial enterprise here, and something that recognizes the political uncertainty surrounding Greenland, as well as what seems to be an opportunity for those living in Greenland to exercise self-determination, and what that means in terms of Greenland and Denmark, as well as the U.S. security relationship, perhaps a deeper relationship politically between the U.S. and Greenland. What's your prediction here, Alex? But what can we expect in the next few years on this? You said it's a decade out before Greenlanders decide. Is it possible this could be addressed prior to in some form of agreement?
I think it has to be addressed prior to, because we can't be in a situation, Roger, where they get independence and we don't have anything waiting for them on the other side. And I think what President Trump seems to be doing is positioning the United States to work trilaterally with the Danes and the Greenlanders to come up with whatever that arrangement is. He says it could be U.S. territory like a Puerto Rico or a Virgin Islands. I've put forward, that's certainly a great option, but I've also said compact should be on the table. And which, the worst outcome, though, is that there is nothing in place and Greenland becomes independent and is immediately set upon by predatory, malign great powers. And that's
it would seem to be that President Trump's recent posts and what he said at the joint session would invite that sort of discussion between an ally. You referenced earlier the hardening of political positions in Greenland, in Denmark, and the beneficiary there would seem to be the People's Republic of China, not the United States, not Danes, and not Greenlanders. So we'll come back to you down the road, perhaps as this file matures, but that's helpful context of what to look out for surrounding the conversation in Greenland and explaining the deep security considerations. All right, we're going to move from Greenland, cross the Atlantic, and go south of the border and head to the Panama Canal, another area which President Trump has emphasized. I think to everyday Americans, somewhat surprising that this would be an area of focus not to those who are China watchers, at least from the standpoint of being concerned of the status of the Panama Canal and what China is doing in the Western Hemisphere. So same game, different subject. Alex Gray, give us the context and update what's been happening in Panama, the Panama Canal, and why, from a security lens, this is such a concern.
Yeah, I mean, look, we built the Panama Canal 100 plus years ago, and it was the largest at the time. It was the largest infrastructure project of modern times.
It was President Trump playing American historian talking about this, right? So the president emphasized this in his joint session.
It's president channeling his HW brands. No, it was very. I tell you, the president loves superlatives, and the Panama Canal it really was a superlative American achievement. And it wasn't just something, obviously, as you know well, this wasn't something that was done because the United States was just a passive observer. We had then, and we have now real strategic interests in the Panama Canal. It's very simple. There's a reason that U.S. Navy ships have been, for over a century, have been built with the Panama Canal's dimensions in mind, because we have to be able to move ships and men and material from the East Coast to the West Coast and then to Asia in the event of crisis. And the Panama Canal remains, after all these decades, the fastest way to do that. And there's obviously economic rationale. There's obviously the post-Panamax, after they've enlarged the canal, the container traffic and shipping traffic is huge. But what I think is still, from Teddy Roosevelt's time to Donald Trump's, what is the most important part of the canal is that it is the vital conduit for U.S. military power to move from Norfolk and Hampton Roads in the East Coast to the Taiwan Strait, to the Korean Peninsula, to the South China Sea. And that is still the dominant reason why we should be concerned that over the last decade or so, Chinese entities have started to control the locks, the bridges, the container and warehousing activities. They've started to take over significant parts of the infrastructure of the canal. And that, to me, and I think to the president and to many of us who follow it, is a real danger to the ability of the United States to use the infrastructure we built for military purposes if necessary.
There's so much to unpack in what you've outlined. I mean, it's a first here on Reaganism that we can reference David McCullough's book, The Path Between the Seas, which is a wonderful, very heavy read about the history of the Panama Canal. For listeners and viewers of Reaganism, certainly President Reagan played a part in this history, because when Jimmy Carter gave it back, or gave it to, I should say, Panamanians, or to Panama, President Reagan at the time, Citizen Reagan, was vehemently opposed and actually debated Bill Buckley over this, friends who debated over whether or not it was in the U.S. interest and the right foreign policy to give it over. Buckley was supportive. Reagan was against, and you can actually view the debates on YouTube. So perhaps a moment of prescience, because it was very much a security concern that President Reagan had. Didn't imagine it would be the People's Republic of China. Thought it might be the Soviet Union, for example, that could exploit that opening, but very much playing out with sort of the concerns, Alex, that you've raised. I mean, I've traveled to Panama. Can't say I have traveled to Greenland, but to Panama, and you see that there is significant Chinese investment. And to the average American, they would say, well, that's a commercial investment. You don't see presence of the PLA, right, as the PRC's military in Panama. But of course, when you're dealing with communist China, there is pretty much no difference between a private concern and a concern of the government, that it's a proxy for the other. And it really very much is challenging our interests. And we see some movement here. I mean, this is one of these developments that capital, in some respects, tends to follow, or can follow, a policy of the U.S. government, in this case, President Trump, putting pressure on who owns the Panama Canal Authority that manages the canal. And I think just recently we've seen U.S. concerns saying that there's going to be, I don't know what the status of the deal is, potential U.S. ownership of those canals, or investment into the concern that manages the canal. Tell us more about that, Alex. What would be sort of a satisfactory outcome from a U.S. national security standpoint?
Well, I think we actually do have to start with Reagan to answer that question. To your point, I wrote an op-ed on this in the Washington Times, and I went back and watched the debates. Everything Ronald Reagan said during the Canal Treaty debates has been 100% right. And you just substitute Soviet Union for China, and he was spot on. And
so just for our viewers and listeners, that wasn't a condition. What Alex Gray just said was not a condition for him joining us on the show today. I knew about the op-ed, but unaware he would make that statement here. But it is welcome and appreciated, Alex. Thank you.
It is. I tell you, Roger, it is unusually prescient, even for Reagan, that he got it so right, in my view. And when you think about where we are, what came to pass is exactly what he said. And he warned during the debate about the treaty that we would be in a position where we didn't have provisions in the treaty, the arbitration provisions, that would have allowed us to really raise objections to how this supposedly independent canal authority was conducting its business. And that's exactly what's happened. The Canal Authority, in my view, has basically violated the key provision of the treaty, which is that the canal be run in a neutral manner. It's not been run in a neutral manner, and I think the best example of that is that Hutchison Whampoa, a Hong Kong company with very deep ties to the Chinese government, is a major...
Well, we said Hong Kong is now effectively run by the PRC. So they're right.
A distinction without a difference, as we both know. And this Hong Kong entity, Hutchison, is, I think we have to view it as an arm of the Chinese state. And Hutchison is operating a significant chunk of the infrastructure in the Panama Canal that directly impacts the operations of the canal. And if we're going to say that we have to have neutrality, if that's what the treaty says, the very act of having the United States' greatest geopolitical and military rival operating significant critical infrastructure in our most militarily significant strategic choke point in our hemisphere, I think that inherently violated the neutrality provision of the treaty. And we were entitled at that point, when that happened a decade ago, to start raising vociferous objections. And we didn't, at least we didn't to the degree that we should have. And now we're in a position where the United States really does face a real threat in the hemisphere. And so, to your point, Roger, we have this unique opportunity where Secretary Rubio and the president have really stepped in, and they've tried to use the bully pulpit of the United States, to use a nice Teddy Rooseveltism for the canal, to go in and to push the Panamanians to honor the meaning of the treaty, the intent of the treaty. And that's all we're trying to do.
Which is the neutrality provision. BlackRock, is what I referenced before, they're coming in reportedly and will take control of managing the ownership of the ports that are critical to our security and the concerns we have about the PRC. I mean, would that solve the problem in your mind if that transaction would play out as reported?
Look, it's going to make a big difference. I would like to see a closer level of U.S. Support, frankly. I mean, I would like to see the United States represented directly on the Canal Commission. I think the United States, because we have such both historic, economic, and military equities, we can't just be passive observers. And so I think there has to be an arrangement whereby going forward, the United States is a direct stakeholder in what happens with the canal.
So the Canal Commission, just for our listeners and viewers, it's not controlled by the Panamanian government. The outcome of the handover of the Panama Canal during President Carter's term was that you'd have this commission that effectively managed it. And it would be a private concern that would ensure that it was run efficiently. And that's their purview. So having a U.S. representative on the commission would be a departure from what we did from the Carter administration to present day, correct?
It would be a departure. I would liken it, not to get too wonky, but I would liken it to Office of Financial Asset Control, OFAC, at the Treasury Department, where they will put trusted Americans on the boards of sanctioned companies to ensure compliance. And I think this is a similar situation where it's such a critical U.S. equity that obviously, my personal opinion is we never should have done the treaty. Reagan was right, Buckley was wrong. But that's 50 years in the past. Now, I think we have to come up with a way to mitigate the problem. And I think part of the solution is a greater U.S. role in the governance of the canal on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's pretty consistent. We have a set of regulations based on executive order. Some of it's in statute that is a national security industrial program. So this sort of construct that if we have a entity that's engaging in national security sensitive work, could be classified, doesn't necessarily have to be. The U.S. government mandates there should be an outside director that's ensuring that the company's obviously doing business and succeeding on behalf of the shareholders. At the same time, though, ensuring that national security concerns are addressed or certainly not undermined. That's quite interesting, Alex, to do that on the commission. But there is no Panamanian equivalent on the commission either, is there?
No, and look, I think there has to be a total revamp of the committee. If we're going to make this work, the commission has to be revamped, and the Panamanians have to understand and have to be made to understand this is a. We use the word existential a little too loosely, in my view. I would say we're bordering on existential when we talk about the role of the canal in U.S. national security. If we cannot use the canal in a crisis, not to mention the economic dimensions of a canal that's been undermined, that is a real significant threat to American interests. And so we have to fundamentally rethink how we're going to organize the canal if we want to continue in the current vein.
Well, one thing you need to control a canal and use a canal are ships, Alex. And one of the things we got to know each other doing was working on shipbuilding, maritime issues back when you were just a Hill staffer. Of course, you've gone on to bigger and better. President Trump emphasized that he's opening a shipbuilding office in his White House, somewhat unprecedented.
Yep.
That is key to all of this. Love to get your take on what we can expect out of that office and how it will complement the sorts of things you're describing as we look at, be it Greenland or more relevant to our hemisphere and our most recent discussion, the Panama Canal.
Well, look, I think it's long overdue. It's a huge success. The fact that we have a shipbuilding office is a huge credit to the president's focus on this issue. When I worked for him in 2016 on this campaign, I saw up close and personal just how passionate he is about the shipbuilding industrial base, and that was borne out in his first term through all manner of policies. And they've got great people working on it, like our friend Jerry Hendricks and others who are really shepherding this and trying to do some really innovative work. What's exciting about it is, as you and I both know, Roger, we are in such a hole with our shipbuilding that if we don't have White House directed presidential level attention, we will not be able to do this just through the normal OMB, House approves, DOD process. This needs a level of political commitment that we haven't seen since Reagan and the 600 ship Navy. And obviously, as you know too, the shipbuilding office's the remit is much broader than just the Navy. It's about the maritime industry writ large. And if we look at the numbers from the size of the maritime industry and the U.S. flagged fleet during the 600 ship Navy, and we look at where we are now, there's been a huge decline alongside the decline of our Navy fleet. The maritime industry as a whole has just declined. And so I think this approach to tackling maritime policy at that White House level, that's the only way we're going to turn this around.
So shortly after the president, maybe the day after the president's speech announcing the opening of this office, in the Oval Office was the chief executive of CMA CGM, which is the largest, I believe, shipbuilder in the world. You can correct me on that.
One of the largest.
One of the largest, to invest $20 billion in the U.S. over the next 4 years to revive, according to the Wall Street Journal's report, American maritime sector. And it's kind of signature President Trump emphasizing an area that he believes the U.S. needs, particularly on the manufacturing, jobs front, bring in the consequential investor or CEO and seek that commitment to invest. How hard is it to get a CEO like that, particularly in the maritime, which is moribund, a declining sector, to say, okay, we're going to do $20 billion worth of investment? And is $20 billion materially impactful, or is it a drop in the bucket in terms of what's needed to get the sector to be at the level that you were just describing?
Well, look, from one company, it is absolutely materially impactful. And I think it sends a signal, a market signal, that the United States maritime industry is open for business. And in an industry, as you know, that has always had a level of industrial policy attached to it. The fact that the president is welcoming CMA-CGM into the White House, and this is clearly something that the president is blessing at the highest level, that sends the type of signal to other players that the industry, what was considered a moribund industry for a long time, that it's back. And it's ready for investment. That's the only way we're going to do this is by you and I think maybe are in a little different place on this. I'm a little more pro industrial policy. I think there's a role for industrial policy when it comes to areas that are national security sensitive, and I think maritime is absolutely one of them. So the combination of kind of top-down directed incentives that we have to protect, sometimes protective actions that need to be taken, things like the Jones Act, to help protect our market share. I think those are things combined with a presidential level of direction and attention. Those are the sorts of things that can really get us where we need to go to rebuild this industry.
Yeah. On the Jones Act and how much we have the sort of government-driven investment industrial policy, you and I would probably disagree about. I do wonder, as we think about our Navy, do we look at opportunities to partner with other countries, allies, that can do it for cheaper and add the numbers that we need? We look back at the Reagan era, there really wasn't something that was required quite as much for President Reagan and his Secretary of Navy, John Lehman. It was about utilizing the private and public yards that were available, and you can get really close to that 600 ship Navy. Seems a lot more difficult, certainly in the window that we probably really need them, to rely on U.S. built ships. And Jones Act may prevent us from getting there. So I said I wouldn't litigate it, but I've already just started litigating. So you can react to that. And then we should also address the bigger question was, what's the goal? Where do we want to get to over the course of the next 4 years and beyond? The value of the 600 ship Navy was a great bumper sticker in addition to actually giving real tangible utility for our national security and realizing our naval strategy in the context of the Cold War. Is there a similar bumper sticker for the Trump administration?
Well, look, I think to only slightly litigate the Jones Act, I think what Secretary Lehman and President Reagan inherited was an industrial base, a maritime industrial base that hadn't yet been hollowed out. And they they didn't have to deal with trying to build a 600 ship Navy with an extraordinarily limited shipyard and ship repair capacity. And that was because at the time we did have a number of protections for our industry and we didn't have China and Korea and others that have been actively trying to undercut the maritime industry and make us uncompetitive on the world market for decades. So I think very different time, as you said, very different set of circumstances. I think there is absolutely a role for talking about modernizing some of the protections. And I strongly support partnering with foreign interests who want to invest in the United States.
And let's get the Finns working with us on icebreakers as we go back and think about the Arctic strategy, for example.
Let's get Hyundai and Hanwha and others into the United States, partnering with American firms, using American infrastructure, hiring American workers, supporting American trade schools to create the next generation of welders and pipe fitters. I mean, I support that, but we have to have some level of protection for national security purposes to keep a minimum U.S. military capacity, maritime capacity for military purposes. Now, to your, I think, probably more important point, where are we headed? In terms of what's the slogan? Where are we headed? And not just from a sloganeering perspective, but from the perspective of, we have to have an objective from a strategic standpoint that we're pacing towards. I continue to think that, 355 Navy ships, the number that was thrown out by, this has to be 10 years ago now.
CNOs, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably the bare minimum at this point, and at least something closer to 400. I just can't, in the world that we're in, with the variety of threats we face and the geographic breadth of the threats we face and the number of aging platforms we have, I just can't imagine a number south of 400 that gets us really where we need to go.
And we're south of 300 today, right? 280 or so.
Yep.
We're with Alex Gray. Great discussion covering Greenland, Panama Canal, and of course the new shipbuilding office in President Trump's White House. Items that were discussed in President Trump's joint session, items that oftentimes don't incorporate the policy rationale and some of the thinking behind it. Alex Gray, of course, has done a lot of that thinking, has driven the policy discussions. We're going to go to our lightning round. Alex, here's where we ask our guests to share their favorite Reagan book, favorite Reagan quote. I think I know which one you might go to on that one. And favorite Reagan speech. Give us all three, two, or just one, whatever you got. We'll take it.
So my favorite, and you're probably the only person other than Secretary Lehman who's probably would have this off the top of your head. His 1985 Annapolis commencement speech, where he laid out probably that I have ever seen the best case for the 600 ship Navy and the best case for the industrial base that would accompany it. And I actually printed that speech out and gave it to President Trump in the 2016 campaign when President Trump was going to do his Philadelphia speech on rebuilding the military. So I think that, to me, that just summarized everything that made Reagan a visionary leader on defense and on sea power. Love
that. Any book you've read on Reagan you want to share?
Look, Peggy Noonan's books. I've read, all of her accounts of as someone who's, I read them long before I worked in the White House, and then read them again after I had worked in the White House. And it's incredibly true to, anyone who has been in that kind of rarefied air, even for a little bit, can relate to some of the experiences that she recounts.
One of the great memoirs, President at the Revolution, and of course, When Character is King. Alex Gray, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Roger.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.